In August 1989, a young Canadian professional hockey star named Duncan MacPherson was supposed to start a new job coaching a hockey team in Scotland, but he never made it there. Numerous police agencies across Canada and Europe tried to find out what had happened to him, from running off with a rich Italian girl to suffering from a case of amnesia and even being recruited as a spy for the CIA. Countless theories emerged over the years as to what happened. However, the truth about Duncan's fate is more shocking than you can imagine. Duncan MacPherson was born February 3, 1966 to Linda and Bob MacPherson in rural Saskatoon, Canada. Throughout his adolescence, Duncan became an amazing hockey player and built up an impressive record playing for the Saskatoon Blades, a major junior ice hockey team. At the time, the Massachusetts-based Springfield Indians acted as a training ground for new players looking to join the New York Islanders among several other pro teams, and from 1984 to 1989, that's where Duncan played. Over those 5 years, though, Duncan was routinely sidelined by various injuries. He also found it difficult to keep up with the higher caliber players he encountered in the new professional world. After lagging behind his teammates and with an unknown future due to injuries, the New York Islanders let him go in 1989. Although some might have thought this would be a huge setback to Duncan, it was not the case. In fact, he was somewhat happy with the decision. You see, Duncan loved hockey more than anything else. However, he did not like the mentality he faced from American teams that he felt seemed not to care about their players or treat them right. He still wanted to be involved with hockey and began applying for numerous coaching jobs overseas in Europe. While Duncan was waiting to hear back on his applications, he began traveling the U.S. to experience some of the things he'd always wanted to, like spending several months hiking up and down the Appalachian Trail. It was one of the happiest times of his life, but things took a turn for the worse when he got home. Somewhere along the trail, Duncan had been bitten by a tick and was infected with Lyme disease. This potentially deadly bloodborne pathogen knocked Duncan for a loop, and he was bedridden at home for almost 2 months while he recovered. After his recovery, he began searching for a hockey coaching job once more, and that's when he was approached by a Vancouver businessman named Ron Dixon. Ron had recently purchased the Dundee Tigers, a Scottish team, and he presented Duncan with a deal that he would be hard-pressed to refuse. According to Duncan, Ron wanted him to be the Tigers' full-time permanent coach. Along with a promised high salary, Duncan could also fulfill his dream of being involved with the sport without all the team politics of the NHL. Although this deal seemed too good to be true, he didn't have any other offers and accepted the position at the end of July 1989. Once Duncan officially said yes, he was given a start date of August 14th. With his schedule now free for a few weeks, Duncan decided to go to Europe to visit some of his buddies, former pro players in North America, who now played or coached for various European teams. He figured it'd be fun to not only see them, but also take in some of the sights around Europe before starting the next chapter of his life. On August 4th, 1989, he left Saskatoon and flew to Nuremberg, Germany, to stay at the home of his friend George Basut. After spending several days with George, Duncan asked if he could borrow his car, a red Opel Corsa, to take a road trip from Germany through Austria and possibly Italy. He promised to return the car by August 11th, since he had a flight to catch to Dundee on August 12th, and George readily agreed. After leaving George's house on August 7th, he drove to Fussen, Germany, to stay at another friend's house. This friend, Roger Kortko, only spent a day with him before Duncan left his home on the morning of August 8th. Duncan had promised his mom he would call on August 14th after he got settled into his new home in Dundee, but by August 16th, she still hadn't heard from him and began to worry. At this point, though, she thought maybe he was just busy and he didn't have time to check in. So she felt a huge sense of relief when her phone rang later that day. But it wasn't Duncan on the other end of the line. Instead, it was his new boss, Ron Dixon. He had listed his parents as his emergency contacts, and he was calling to see if they knew where he was at. It turned out that Duncan had never shown up for his new job. His parents, knowing that Duncan would never throw an opportunity like this away, were extremely worried and knew that something must have happened to him, and they filed a missing persons report with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police that same day. Although officers promised them that Duncan's photo and information would be passed to Interpol, who would then distribute it to every police station, border checkpoint, and jail in Europe, his parents were not going to sit idly by and wait for this to happen. Instead, they hopped on the next available flight and flew to Germany to begin retracing his steps. Once Duncan's parents landed, they first went to George Basut's home in Nuremberg. When they questioned him, he told them that he had been equally worried since he had failed to return his car on time. George knew this was not like the normally responsible Duncan that he knew, and he had already spoken to police about filing a missing persons report in Nuremberg. However, when he tried to do so, the officers refused to take it. They simply told him Duncan was a strong young man who probably had ran off with a rich Italian or Austrian girl. Of course, both George and his parents knew this was false, since he was in such a committed relationship and his girlfriend was supposed to be moving in with him in Scotland the following week. Although George couldn't tell Duncan's parents much about his plans, he did know that he went to Fusen to visit with Roger Kurtko, and he was the next person they would speak to. According to Roger, Duncan didn't really have a well-thought-out itinerary. He told them that Duncan had stated he wanted to visit Austria and then might visit a friend in Bolzano, Italy, or go windsurfing at Lake Garda in northern Italy before returning to Nuremberg on August 9th. Unsure of exactly where he went from there, his parents pulled out a road map of Central Europe and figured that if he were going to drive to northern Italy, he would have to pass through the Austrian city of Innsbruck. Along the way, this would be their next stop. Innsbruck and its environs are a huge tourist attraction in Austria. The area known as Tyrol is filled with mountains and glaciers perfect for hiking, skiing, and snowboarding. Although it was August, a few ski slopes were still open around the famous Dubai Valley, which formed the epicenter of the tourist hotspots in the area. Duncan had to have been there. Once Duncan's parents arrived in Innsbruck, they woke up the next morning to find one of the most beautiful sights they'd ever seen. Spread all around them were rolling hills, steep mountains, and tons of snow. Linda knew her son would love this area and must still be here. Based on mother's intuition, the pair began searching for Duncan in the Innsbruck area. Due to the narrow roads and mountain passes, the couple feared that Duncan might have driven off the road. For days, they drove up and down the mountain road, stopping at each bend to peer down below to see if they saw anything. Not finding any wrecked cars, they also searched the local lakes. Duncan had talked about wanting to windsurf in Italy. Maybe he'd gotten into an accident and had drowned in the water. But alas, none of the lakes that they went to had any traces of Duncan. Undeterred, they began speaking to local police to inquire about their investigation into his disappearance. But when they went to speak to the police, they were shocked to hear that they had not heard about this case. Once his parents had informed the police officials in Innsbruck, they promised to look into it. Taking them at their word, they began crisscrossing the country to different border checkpoints. At the Italian border, his parents were equally miffed that his information had not been shared there either. At the Swiss border, these officers likewise knew nothing about the case. Infuriated, they demanded the Royal Canadian Mounted Police submit the information to Interpol again. And while they promised to do so, this would be the first of what would turn out to be many empty promises from both the Canadian and Austrian governments. Feeling that no one else was taking Duncan's disappearance seriously, his parents declined to continue looking for him on their own. Because his passport had not been checked in at either the Italian or Swiss borders, Linda knew that her son most likely never left the Innsbruck area. They implored the local police to see if they had checked the hotel records in town, but they were told that it was simply too big of a task and would require an army of investigators to do it. This response was a common theme that the pair ran into during their search for Duncan. After almost 2 weeks of going door to door and calling every hotel and hostel they could find, they finally got their first big break. One of the local hostels they called did indeed have a record of Duncan staying there. He checked in for one night on the evening of August 8th and left the next morning. He did not stay any other nights. It wasn't much, but it was something. Finally, with the first hard proof that Duncan had been in the area, his parents pleaded with the local police to circulate his missing persons report. However, they cited Austrian privacy laws that because he was an adult, he could be missing if he wanted to. Besides, if something had happened and his car was abandoned, someone would have reported it by now, they reasoned. Infuriated, the couple then found a sympathetic Austrian newspaper to broadcast a missing persons report that they paid for with their own money. It would go on air in a few weeks, and in the meantime they decided to try the Canadian consulate in West Germany to help get them moving past the Austrian police who were stonewalling them. But once the couple arrived at the consulate, no one there wanted to speak with him, and every time they asked to speak with the Canadian ambassador, they kept saying he was too busy. Finally, after 2 days, his second-in-command finally met with them. During the conversation, he gave no new information. He continued to give them the same line that the Austrians had been giving to them. Duncan was a big, strong boy. He was probably fine. Of course, they knew this was not the case. In a strange gesture of goodwill, the officer insisted that they have dinner with him that night at his mansion. Of course, the couple was reluctant, but he would not take no for an answer. That night, during dinner at the mansion, the officer received a call that would change their lives forever. Duncan's car had been found. Within hours of the airing of the TV advertisement the couple had paid for, a parking lot attendant at a hotel near Innsbruck reported that Duncan's car was there. Duncan's parents immediately left Germany that night and drove as fast as they could to Innsbruck. Upon arrival at the police station, though, they found that something was off. The police told them that they'd already gotten inside the car and removed all of Duncan's belongings. The couple was given a bag containing his belongings, and when Bob asked the officers if they had fingerprinted the car, they said they had no reason to fingerprint it. When his parents inquired as to why his belongings were not left in the state they were found in, the officers did not respond. What was going on? Once the officers handed over his items, it only solidified their suspicions that something was off. They claimed that all that was inside the car was a backpack filled with some clothes, his passport, and a bag of now rotten fruit. When pressed on where exactly the car was, though, officers refused to say. However, when they saw a police car leave the station, they decided to follow it to see where it was going. After tailing the police car for a short while, they soon found it. Parked facing the Stubai Valley, the car had sat in the parking lot now for 42 days, without anyone reporting it before the news report ran. It was hard to believe that the car had sat for so long in an area that prided itself on looking out for one another. After getting inside the car, the couple found a few other items, but one in particular caught their eye. It was an audio cassette in the center console that had the logo for a local music store. His parents went there, and the saleswoman positively identified Duncan as having bought the cassette. She told them something else too, that when he came in, he had been with another man. Now armed with concrete evidence, including the car, the hostel receipt, and the witness identification that he had been in Innsbruck, the couple focused their search on alpine hotels in the area, starting with the Alpensport Hotel in Mutterbergam. After entering the hotel, they began to ask the front desk if Duncan had ever stayed there, when a surprise visitor approached them. His name was Walter Hinterholzel. He was the hotel's resident snowboarding instructor, and he said he remembered Duncan very well. According to Walter, Duncan had rented a snowboard and booked a lesson with him on the morning of August 9th. Duncan, with his excellent physique and balance as a hockey player, performed quite well, especially considering that it was his first time snowboarding. Walter remarked during the lesson his clothes became wet from snow and sweat, and that he had placed some of them in his office to dry out. Walter then stated that Duncan claimed he was going to practice by himself on the slope for a few more hours, and that the next morning he would take another lesson with him. However, the next morning came and went, with no sign of Duncan. Walter didn't suspect anything and assumed he must have just went on to do something else. But when several weeks had passed and Duncan had not picked up his clothes, he took them home to his apartment. With Walter's testimony, an important gap had been filled. But they now had another crucial question that would determine the trajectory of the search. Was the snowboard returned to the rental shop? If not, then it meant that Duncan had likely gone missing while snowboarding and could still be out there somewhere. So Duncan's parents went to the rental shop and spoke with the employee present. They asked to see the rental records from August for their missing son. The woman, visibly shaking and nervous, glanced over to the manager, who quickly stepped in. The manager claimed that they had just switched systems from maintaining their rental records, and the ones from August had already been thrown away. However, he assured them that with his ironclad memory, Duncan's snowboard had been returned. Frustrated at the lack of assistance, the couple doubled down on their search efforts before the winter snows began to fall, which would cover everything around them and seal in the truth of what happened, potentially forever. But soon they would get a helping hand from across the Atlantic. A sympathetic Canadian businessman had heard about their plight. He offered to send a world-renowned search and rescue team to Austria, at no expense to the parents. With their state-of-the-art computer programs, helicopters, and tracking dogs, the team was one of the best in the business. Duncan's parents readily agreed and thought this was the opportunity they were waiting for. But unknown to them, the police were again actively working against them. Because the search and rescue team claimed that often relatives are involved in a loved one's disappearance, they had to get all the information straight from the police, despite the couple being the only ones actually trying to find Duncan. But the couple bit their tongue and decided to let the team do their job. However, the Austrian police knowingly sent them looking in wrong places. According to diplomatic cables that Lindsay obtained later, even at this early stage, the police had a working theory as to what happened. According to them, they believed Duncan had simply fallen into a crevasse and died. Crevasses can be especially deadly during the winter months, since they're often covered in a thin sheet of snow or ice, and stepping on one can send a person plummeting 10, 30, or even 100 or more feet into a dark, icy tomb. But the Austrian authorities had not disclosed this to Duncan's parents or the search and rescue team. So instead of searching the Stubai Glacier, the team spun their wheels aimlessly, searching the mountains around it. After several weeks of searching, the team, faced with no other options, called it quits and went home. Although they did not want to, Duncan's parents soon returned home too, though they vowed to return as soon as the weather permitted. Over the next 14 years, the couple would make 9 separate trips to Austria to search for their son. Often, as Bob recalls, some locals and the police would show up, but they wouldn't even acknowledge him. It seemed as if the locals were tired of them showing up and hoped the pair would just go away if they were rude enough to them. But they never gave up searching for their son. Over time, as each search in the hiking trails around the Stubai Valley or the glacier itself proved nothing new, the couple began to grow increasingly desperate for answers. In November 1993, German television ran an exposé on Duncan's case. After one of its few reruns a few months later, a German woman from Nuremberg called the MacPherson household directly. What she said next was perhaps the most solid evidence of what had happened to Duncan yet. According to her, she had a close friend in Klagenfurt, Austria, several hours away from Innsbruck, who was caring for a man with severe amnesia. The man was tall, spoke only North American English, and had 2 missing front teeth that were corrected with dental implants. He had been found wandering in the woods around Innsbruck in early September 1989, with no wallet or identification, as well as being malnourished. The man could not remember his name, but took on the name of Mark Schofman. The only thing he could remember about his past life was living in New York State. To Linda and Bob, this was it. Their son and this mystery man had similar physical characteristics. Duncan only spoke English and had lost some of his Canadian accent after living in the States for several years. Most importantly, the man said he had lived in New York, which is where Duncan split his time between there and Massachusetts. But how had Duncan gotten amnesia? There is medical evidence that in rare cases of Lyme disease, the patient can eventually develop amnesia. With this illness happening just a few months before, his parents were certain that this was their son. Linda immediately called the Canadian embassy and asked them to look into it. In one of the few helpful times in this case, the Canadian authorities were able to track down the location of this man and verify he was in fact real. The man, who was now known as Mark, had been discharged from a psychiatric facility and was living with a foster family to get back on his feet. Canadian and Austrian authorities sent several photos of the man to his parents. Unfortunately, the man bore no resemblance to Duncan. Undeterred, one of Duncan's friends from Germany drove to Austria to see the man in person. He too confirmed they did not look alike. These suspicions were confirmed when dental records conclusively proved that the mystery man was not their son. Duncan MacPherson was still out there, somewhere. Though this lead had been the most promising to date, the case would take another turn in the late 90s when Linda sued the Canadian government to release diplomatic cables between them and the Austrian government. After several years of litigation, the Canadian government finally released nearly 800 pages of sensitive documents relating to the investigation. And while these documents proved without a doubt that the Austrian police had lied to them, they also presented another angle. Inside this trove of documents were several pages of completely redacted correspondence between Canada and what was then known as Czechoslovakia. But what sort of secrets could these documents be hiding? Then it hit her. Before leaving for Europe, Duncan had claimed to his parents that a CIA agent had approached him in America and wanted to recruit him. Though the role sounded interesting, it would entail creating a new identity and leaving his old life behind, something Duncan did not want to do. But how credible was this? During the Cold War, it was not uncommon to recruit foreign athletes, especially ones like Duncan who played for teams that traveled around the world. Hockey players like him could infiltrate communist countries with legitimate cover stories. Once inside, they could spy for countries like the US. Linda figured that maybe he'd been caught up spying in Czechoslovakia and was imprisoned there on espionage charges. This would jive with some reports that the couple had gotten in the years since his disappearance. Several witnesses claimed to have seen Duncan in Moscow and several other cities in Eastern Europe. Maybe Duncan had taken the CIA up on their offer of a new life, but had been captured in Czechoslovakia. Linda had to know for sure. She sued the Canadian government again to release the redacted documents, and after another long court battle, she won. But when she got them, she was dismayed to see that the cables were nothing more than the Canadian government asking if Duncan had been in Czechoslovakia, with the Czechs answering negative. No CIA cover-up after all. In July 2003, the Stubai Valley was sweltering under the hottest summer on record. Because of this, numerous bodies were turning up inside crevasses that had been hidden for decades. On July 18th on the Stubai Glacier, a piece of yellow fabric was seen sticking up out of a crevasse. Upon closer inspection, the fabric was a jacket covering a body. Officials immediately assumed it to be Duncan, and the Canadian embassy was called to inform them. After arriving in Austria, Linda and Bob soon learned that the body had to be taken to Innsbruck. But upon arriving at the Institute of Forensic Medicine there, they were greeted by a Dr. Walter Rabel. The Austrian police had ordered Dr. Rabel to perform an identification of the corpse, utilizing both DNA analysis on a piece of his left femur and dental records. Dr. Rabel positively ID'd the body as that of the missing Duncan MacPherson. Duncan's body had been found. But what had really happened to him, and why did it seem like everyone was trying to cover up the truth? When Linda and Bob were let into the examining room to see their son, a large white sheet was covering him, with only his head being exposed. His skin, like thick black leather after being encased in his icy tomb all these years, still looked remarkably like their son. After being left alone for a few moments, Linda kissed her son goodbye and they joined Dr. Rabel to inquire about an autopsy. Linda had been convinced for years that Duncan had fallen into a crevasse, and then a snow groomer had buried him alive. She wanted an autopsy done to confirm the theory. However, according to Dr. Rabel, an autopsy in this case was unnecessary, since it would not likely reveal a cause of death. His parents insisted on the autopsy, but Dr. Rabel stated he would only do it if ordered by the local prosecutor. After his parents spoke with the local prosecutor, he told them an autopsy was unnecessary since it was clear Duncan had fallen into a crevasse and died. Still wanting answers, they asked Dr. Rabel if he could at least take some detailed x-rays and a CT scan of the body. They also wanted the items found with him, which included his clothing, a snowboard, and snow boots. While the couple waited for the additional medical evidence, they noticed something odd. His snowboard and clothing looked like they'd been shredded in a machine. These observations would later be key, but they didn't know it at the time. In the meantime, they went to the police headquarters to see what the police would say. During the conversation, the police reluctantly agreed to show the couple the photographs. The photos included 3 pictures from 4:56, 4:57, and 5:10 that afternoon. They showed ski slope employees working to get Duncan out, and a 4th photo 20 minutes later shows that he was out of the crevasse. Importantly, there were no police, detectives, or medical personnel present. The discovery and excavation of Duncan had been entirely carried out by hotel staff. Officers simply picked up the body and left. When the couple returned to Dr. Rabel's office, they questioned him about the state of the snowboard. After all, it looked chewed up. Instead of calling the police, he called the hotel. Speaking with the staff, they claimed that when excavating the body, they had used a snow groomer's tiller to help free Duncan. But the couple had no other recourse except to wait on their son's body. While the family encouraged them to transport the body home, its cost and their desire to have him home quickly made them cremate him in Austria. Once home, the couple began digging deeper into the evidence and discovered something was not right at all. After returning to Canada, the couple began looking over the photos that Dr. Rabel had given them, and what they saw was shocking. The injuries to Duncan were massive. His head, left arm, left hand, left knee, left leg, and left foot had all been severed. When looking at these shocking photos, the couple asked Dr. Rabel how this could have happened. He explained that bodies stuck in ice are often subjected to intense forces as they move down the mountain and spit out toward the bottom. These natural forces would explain all the damage sustained, but the couple wasn't buying it. After consulting with numerous forensic anthropologists, medical doctors, and an expert in ski slope accident reconstruction, they all came to the same conclusion. Duncan's injuries had not been caused by natural forces, and there was plenty of evidence to back this up. For one, there was the location Duncan was found. He was still on the ski slope, essentially encased in the natural tomb where he lay. In cases where glaciers tear up a body, the person has to make their way all the way down the mountain, and this process typically takes hundreds of years. Not only was Duncan found right near where he probably died, but the damage to his body was inconsistent. If Mother Nature had ripped his body apart, it would not have selectively done so only on his left side. Additionally, the damage was too precise. All of his severed body parts looked as if they'd been sliced by a machine, not crunched and broken by ice. Photos from the Institute of Forensic Medicine prove this further, since his left foot, left knee, and left hand were found in a pile, stuck together separate from his head, which was separate from his trunk. And while the forensic anthropologist did not have a good answer on how he died, the ski accident reconstruction expert did. From the marks on his body along with his shredded snowboard, the expert was able to scientifically prove that the marks had the same measurements as those from the tiller on the snow groomer. But what did the Austrians have to say about that? According to the hotel employees who spoke with Dr. Rabel, they'd used a snow groomer to help remove Duncan's body from the crevasse. However, Linda had taken photos of the slope the same week his body had been recovered. There was absolutely zero snow on the ground, and the employees were observed using snow groomers to get around, but the tillers were in the upright position. Additionally, trying to back a tiller into a giant hole does nothing. Even people who had not seen snow a day in their lives could tell you that by looking at a snow groomer. Based on all of this evidence, this is the most plausible theory about what really happened to Duncan MacPherson on August 9, 1989. After lunch with his snowboard instructor, Duncan returned to the slope to keep practicing. Because of the heavy fog and light rain that day, most of the guests left the mountain around lunchtime. So that afternoon, Duncan was probably the only person on the mountain still snowboarding. Wanting to make the most of his trip, he probably felt the need to keep practicing to make the next day's lesson even better. Sometime during that afternoon, as Duncan was snowboarding, he went over a crevasse that was commonly exposed during this time of year. Due to the damage to his ankles and femur, it's most likely he suffered a severe injury that left him incapacitated. That afternoon, a snow groomer left the resort to get an early start on finishing the day's work, due to most guests leaving early. Whether Duncan was conscious is unclear, but the evidence shows that he had taken off his snow boots and was lying on the ground with just his boot liners on. It's very possible he passed out due to a combination of shock from blood loss and hypothermia. However, his injuries were still likely survivable. As the snow groomer approached, Duncan may have tried to signal to the driver that he was there and needed to be rescued. Or he could have said nothing due to being passed out, and the driver never saw or heard him due to the loud machinery and poor weather conditions. As the driver got near Duncan, the snow groomer itself missed him, but the tiller, which extends further out than the rest of the vehicle, clipped his left leg, which he had been holding with his left hand, and sucked him and his snowboard into the machine. In a matter of moments, Duncan would have died. Because the tiller likely spit the snowboard out and hit the snow groomer, the driver would have exited the vehicle and stumbled upon the grisly scene. What happened next will never be known for sure. Whether the employee acted alone because he was afraid of being arrested for negligent homicide, drunk driving, or both is unclear. Perhaps there was a conspiracy between himself and the other resort staff to bury the dead tourist. This is most likely, considering the shroud of secrecy surrounding his case. But what was the motive for the conspiracy? The Stubai Glacier was and remains today the lifeblood of the local economy. Because of this, influential people in the area have always been keen to keep any negative publicity out of the limelight. The MacPhersons, with their ever-present persistence, were a threat to their business. If the truth had gotten out that a tourist had died on the ski slope, their bottom line would have definitely taken a hit. This was something local business leaders who kept police officer salaries high could not tolerate. In their eyes, if a tourist died, it meant nothing to them in the grand scheme of things. But to Linda and Bob MacPherson, Duncan was more than just a dollar sign. He was their son. For more bizarre missing person stories, check out the most disturbing stories of people going missing, or watch this video instead.